Would you open your Bibles, please, to Matthew chapter 17, verse 22. Last week we saw Jesus encountering the aftermath of a failed healing. He came down the Mount of Transfiguration with 3 of the disciples and discovered that the other 9 who'd stayed behind couldn't cast out a demon from a boy. Why could we not cast it out? They asked Jesus after he does it with a word. Because of your little faith, he says to them. And we said last week that Jesus wasn't talking so much about the little quantity of their faith, so much as he was talking about the little quality of their faith. It doesn't seem like he's talking about a quantity of faith, because the very next thing he says is that even faith the size of a grain of mustard seed could have had mountain-moving outcomes. And besides, we said last week, faith isn't a substance you can really have more or less of. In the words of R.T. France, it's not a measurable commodity. Faith is more like a relationship. It's a living connection with an omnipotent God that starts and matures as we learn to trust him. It's a relationship built on trust. We trust God for the future based on his perfect track record of faithfulness to others and to us in the past, so that faith is a bit like breathing, we said last week. We take in his word as the breath of life, and then in our thoughts and in our actions and in our prayers, we breathe out our trust in what he has said. And since in the past that next breath of life has always come, it's always been there, it has never failed to be there, we have no reason to believe it will fail to come again in the future. Faith is a living connection that increasingly looks to and leans on God rather than looking to and leaning on one's own resources and one's own understanding, we said. And so instead of talking about some quantity of faith, Jesus seems to have been rebuking these 9 disciples for a faith of little or poor quality. A poor quality faith is a relationship that's lacking some crucial element. It's like paper mache without the flour, or without the glue, or without, I guess the flour and the glue are interchangeable sometimes, or without the water, right? Basically, the idea is you take out one crucial ingredient and everything falls apart. And so in the case of faith, maybe that ingredient or element that's lacking in some of the basic information about who Jesus is or what Jesus came to do. Or maybe all the basic information is there, but it's a faith that's lacking agreement with some of the information. Or maybe it's a faith that's got the basic information and it agrees with that information in general, that it's true for other people, but there's a lack of personal buy-in. Just by way of example, we've all heard the results really that come out of every survey, survey after survey in the United States that tell us that most Americans still identify themselves as Christian. Most Americans, and for decades, when they put out these surveys, most Americans identify themselves as Christian. Now, granted, that percentage has dropped a great deal in these polls in the last 20 years, but the fact is it's still an overwhelming majority in this country who claim the Christian faith as their own. That's really remarkable. And yet the sad fact is that majority percentage just isn't reflected in the reality of our nation, is it? That percentage isn't reflected in the pews. That percentage isn't reflected at the ballot box. That percentage isn't reflected in the moral values that our nation chooses to promote and protect, which tells us that ours is also a generation, ours is a nation and a generation, if not almost completely faithless, it's at least one that's at the very least also filled with people of little quality faith. But what crucial element is missing for these disciples? Going back to our text, what is it that's missing for them that's affecting the quality of their faith? Was it a lack of information? Was it a lack of belief in that information? Was it a lack of personal buy-in? Well, I'm not sure it was the same thing for all of them. I don't know that it was necessarily all the same ingredient that was missing for all of them. As we'll see today, none of them has all the information yet, at least not in the same way we have all the information today. For them, events are unfolding in real time. And they don't have the benefit of 20/20 vision that comes with the hindsight of history like we do. Must have been hard. And then some of them, remember, they've seen things that others in the group haven't seen, right? Only 3 of them are armed with the reassuring preview of Christ's revealed glory on the mountain, for instance. The rest of them have never seen Jesus visibly look like anything other than a completely normal human being. But as we'll see today, even some of the basic information they do all have, they still all struggle to believe. Like what? Well, like what Jesus keeps telling them is going to happen to him when they get to Jerusalem. Today, in the 2 verses of our text, Jesus will give what's sometimes referred to as the second of 3 passion predictions. The second of 3 formal announcement about his coming suffering, death, and resurrection that he makes before they get to Jerusalem. And if you remember, he made the first of these announcements back in chapter 16, just the last chapter we were in, verse 21. And you remember this led to Peter taking Jesus aside and rebuking him, right? That's not the plan, Jesus. This is the plan. But now Jesus predicts it again. And this time, I think it's interesting to notice that nobody rebukes him. I think they've learned their lesson a little bit. No one says anything. Look at verses 22 and 23. We'll read it all together here. As they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. And they will kill him, and he will be raised on the 3rd day." And they were greatly distressed, it says. Luke's gospel tells us they were afraid to even ask what he meant. They're not opening their mouths. They're not going to make that mistake again. Our text begins with these words, as they were gathering in Galilee. The word there for gathering, it's used in an unusual way, and there's some disagreement about exactly why or what it means here, but I think it's just a way of reminding us that the 12 have been separated. And, some on the mountain, some in the valley, and now they're back as one united group in the staging area of Galilee where they'll make their final preparations for the journey south into Judean territory. Galilee is the region to the north where Jesus and the disciples have been carrying on most of the ministry work, and now they're getting ready to head toward Jerusalem, which is in the southern region of Judea. But here it's as if Matthew wants us to know something. It's as if he wants us to know that the most important preparation of all that could be made was for them to hear this same startling announcement about Jesus' suffering and death and resurrection. And the question you should ask yourself is, why is that so important? Why is that so important? Why should they hear another prediction about this? And why must we hear another sermon about it? Half the commentaries I look at, they just skip this altogether. They're like, we talked about that. We're not going to waste paper talking about that again. So why are we? Why does Jesus keep repeating this news? What these men hear as only terrible news that leaves them greatly distressed, but it's the same news that Paul will later call the good news of central importance, of first importance in 1 Corinthians 15. It's the same news. Why does Jesus keep bringing this up? Maybe you've bought a tree at a nursery before. We had a nursery in Weaverville we liked to go to, and we would go there for fun, even if we weren't going to buy something. But sometimes you go to a nursery and you have this tree you want to buy, and you want to take it from this pot, and you want to transplant it into a hole in the ground. And basically, if you've ever done that, they tend to warn you about something that's called transplant shock. Anybody heard about transplant shock? Yeah. And so there's, basically, it can be so bad that it can cause the plant to die if you're not careful. And so because this tree can die if you're not careful, they tell you, okay, here's some things you can do to prevent transplant shock, this worst case scenario being death. You can do little things like not bump the root ball too much as you're moving the tree. Don't shake all the dirt out of the roots. Oh, it's all dirty, I got to clean it up. Don't do that as you're moving it from here to here, from point A to point B. But probably the most common way to avoid the kind of shock that leads to the death of a tree is to frequently water that tree. Water it thoroughly a while before you pull it out of its pot. Keep that root ball moist during the transplantation process, and then water it again really well after the plant has been moved to its new home. And I think that's what Jesus is doing here with all of these passion predictions. I think that's what Jesus is doing. I think all of this repetition is Jesus saturating the soil. It's Jesus getting the disciples as primed as he possibly can for the shocking event that will finally move them from point A to point B in their understanding of who he is and why he's come, which is that event which is his suffering and his death and his resurrection. Jesus is saying here, listen, your expectations need to change. I'm not going to be popular, and neither are you. Sorry, guys. I'm not going to be loved by most people, and neither are you. I'm not going to Jerusalem to be honored, and neither are you. I'm not going there to get a crown, but a cross. I'm going to suffer and to die, and then I'm going to be raised back to life. And this is going to be hard for you. But this is how I save you. Jesus, during his entire earthly ministry, has been working carefully to transplant expectations. He's been working to move people from one set of expectations about the Christ to another set of expectations. And for a while, he's done this to some extent with the bigger crowds. But now, especially as the end of his life draws near, he more and more focuses his efforts on making sure that his inner circle of disciples are settled as they can be on the basics of his person and his work. And so he saturates their ears with the basics. Let these words sink into your ears, he says to them in the same account in Luke's gospel. He repeats the basics of who he is and what he's come to do in Jerusalem again and again, so that when these events finally take place, their understanding and their expectations will finally be moved without killing them. Without killing them. And so we're going to look at those basics again today, too. Today we're going to look at three basic questions about Jesus that we all need to have settled too, now rather than later. Because the fact of the matter is, many of us still struggle with wrong understandings and expectations about who Jesus is and what he came to do and what it will mean to follow him too. And again, even some of the basic understandings that we all do have about these things, we still struggle to believe as well. Jesus is so nice and so lovable, we think. All he does is heal people and speak the truth, right? And so how can it be that anyone would hate him and his followers? If that happens, we think it has to be operator error, right? It has to be something we're doing wrong as Christians with Christ's message. Maybe we're not being clear enough. Maybe we're not being creative enough with the way we share that message. Maybe we're not being winsome enough. That must be why people don't like us. Because if the world only understood what Jesus was like and what he said and what he did, we think, then they couldn't possibly hate our Savior and his people. But those thoughts reveal wrong expectations about Jesus. and what it's going to mean to follow him. And so today we're going to look again at three things. We're going to look, A, at who Jesus is, B, what happens to him in Jerusalem, and C, how we're to respond. And here's why. Because God knows that for some of you too, and I don't know who you are, but God knows, for some of you too, unless you're repeatedly primed and saturated with these basics now, your little quality faith won't survive the shock the first time you suffer for his name. And so first, God's people need to settle for themselves this basic question about Jesus. Who is he? Well, how does this text help us settle that question better? Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, verse 23, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And they were greatly distressed. I think this text helps us answer that question better this way, by highlighting the different titles for Jesus used in the context of the two passion predictions we've heard so far. This is what I mean. Back in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, we saw Jesus reveal that he must suffer, he must be killed, and on the third day be raised, immediately following the confession of Peter that he is the Christ. So that the first aspect we learn about Jesus in connection with his suffering is that he is Jesus the Christ. The Christ. And we've talked about this before, this is significant because it's one thing for Jesus to identify himself as the Christ. Everyone was waiting for him to do this. Everyone was hoping for him to do this. We've said many times that the Jews were expecting the Christ. They were expecting the Messiah, their long-awaited Redeemer and King. They were looking for the Christ. They were waiting for him. And so it's one thing for Jesus to identify himself as the Christ, but it's another thing altogether for the Christ to be identified as one who will suffer. Why? Well, because as we've also said many times, the Christ the Jews were expecting was an invincible military hero coming on a war horse in glory to triumph over their enemies and restore their nation to great power. Not some carpenter who'd be killed by the religious authorities. And now here in our text today, in this second formal passion prediction, Jesus this time uses his favorite nickname for himself and says, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men, be killed, and be raised to new life. So that the second aspect we now learn about Jesus in connection with his suffering is that he is Jesus, the Son of Man. And this is significant because it's one thing for Jesus to identify himself as a Son of Man, the way Ezekiel is called a Son of Man by God 93 times in the sense of being a regular human being. But it's another thing when you realize that Jesus is identifying himself as the Son of Man, the one spoken of in Daniel chapter 7, the one who comes there with the clouds of heaven, the one who approaches the Ancient of Days and is led into his presence, the one who's given authority and glory and sovereign power and is worshipped by peoples and nations and men of every language, the one whose dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away and whose kingdom will never be destroyed. That is saying something else about Jesus. That is saying something else. And we know that this is the self-identification Jesus has meant all along by using this nickname, because it's how he identifies himself one last time to Caiaphas at his trial. And that finally slams the door on his release when it's realized what he's claiming. Jesus said to him, I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? Matthew 26, 64 and 65. Why does Caiaphas call Jesus' words blasphemy? Well, because the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7 bears the marks and the rights reserved only for God. And so it's one thing for Jesus to identify himself as a Son of Man. But it's another thing altogether for him to identify himself as the Son of Man, as one on the same level as God, and then for the Son of Man to be identified as one who will suffer. One who will suffer. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And it's important to see that Jesus doesn't say this will happen by accident. He says, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. That word translated is about to communicates intense certainty. It could be translated will be. In the words of Leon Morris, it's an expression often used to denote an action that necessarily follows a divine decree. In other words, this suffering of the Son of Man is destined by God to happen. It must happen. It will certainly happen. And the reason this is so important is because it's the language of prophecy. It's important because it would have pointed to yet another person, yet another familiar figure from the Old Testament who was singled out to sacrificially suffer, a figure known as the suffering servant of the Lord, most famously depicted in Isaiah 52 and 53. There, at the end of Isaiah 52, comes the start of the description of this famous servant figure who will suffer. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. The prediction of this servant's substitutionary suffering now continues into Isaiah chapter 53. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This description of this suffering servant continues for another 6 verses. It's a description of a figure who is destined to come, who must come, who will certainly come to suffer and die to pay for the sins of others, and then rise again, who will serve as a priest to the nations of the world and apply his blood to make things right between sinners and God, cleansing those who believe. So that the more predictions Jesus makes about his own certain suffering and death and resurrection, the more clear it becomes that he is this very suffering servant Isaiah has foretold. And so the third aspect we now learn about Jesus in connection with his suffering is that he is Jesus, the suffering servant of the Lord. It's him. So that the effect of this verse, this small verse, in connection with the other 2 formal passion predictions, the effect is a cumulative one. Taken together, all these announcements Jesus makes are significant because, as one commentator puts it, it appears that no one before Jesus had ever identified the Christ, the Son of Man, and the suffering servant of the Old Testament as three aspects of the one Redeemer and King the people were all waiting for. And you know, it's important for you to know these things about the one Redeemer and King that you follow too. It's important that you know this. You need to be aware of the basic prophesied aspects of his reception and his role on earth. We need to know these things. It's important because if you answer the question, who is Jesus, with only the understanding that he is the beloved and honored and respected Savior of the world, chances are you'll also expect to be beloved and honored and respected by the world when you follow him. But if that's the case, you're in for a rude surprise. And so Jesus still says, listen, your expectations need to change. I'm not going to be popular, and most likely, neither are you. I'm not going to be loved by most people, and neither are you. I'm not going to be honored by most of this faithless and twisted generation, and neither are you. I'm going to have to take up the shame of a cross in order to save you. And to follow me will mean you have to take up the shame of my name and suffer for it too. This is the point. If you will learn now that he who was perfect love was also despised and rejected of men, then it won't be quite so shocking when the world treats you the same way later. If you learn and remember that lesson now, it won't cause your faith to unravel, to buckle. It won't cause you to immediately assume that you've done something wrong the first time the world reacts to you with horror and hatred simply for believing and saying the same loving, true things that Jesus said. Today we're looking at three basic questions about Jesus we need to settle. And that's because many of us, just like the 12, still struggle with wrong understandings and expectations about the basics of who Jesus is and what he came to do and what it will mean to follow him. And so the first question we have to answer, we have to settle, is who is he? And now the second basic question we have to settle is, what happens to him in Jerusalem? And we need to have that settled because more than anything else, the events that take place there are the focus of the whole Bible. In fact, what happens to Jesus there has even been called the hinge of history. The hinge of history. And so look with me again at the end of verse 22. There we see, first of all, that what will happen to Jesus in Jerusalem is that he will be betrayed. Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men." When Jesus gave his first formal prediction of what was to come in Jerusalem, we learned that he would suffer many things at the hands, and he names names, right? At the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. But at that first time, we weren't told how that would happen. Well, now Jesus adds this important new element, that he will be delivered into the hands of these men. That word for delivered might just sound like something the FedEx guy does with your packages, but the word in Greek here and the word does just mean to hand over. But as commentator R.T. France puts it, context is everything. Context supplies the nature and motivation of the act. In other words, are we talking about the happy entrusting of a puppy to a friend, the delivering over of a puppy to a friend? That's one context. Or are we talking about the grim entrusting of an enemy to a judge, the delivering of an enemy to a judge? And the fact is, so far in Matthew, the two times we've had this term used have been in a negative context. One of them describing what happens to John the Baptist when he's arrested, and the other used to describe what an accuser does when bringing a person before a judge. But even more conclusively, this same word for handing over will be used 4 more times in Matthew in clear connection to Judas. 4 more times. So that R.T. France can conclude that this word for delivered quickly became the standard term for Judas's betrayal. In other words, when Jesus says the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, he's predicting his approaching betrayal by Judas, even though he doesn't name Judas yet. And so that's the first thing that will happen to Jesus in Jerusalem. What's the second thing? We see next in the first part of verse 23 that he will be killed. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, verse 23, and they will kill him. Again, Jesus is making it crystal clear that he's not going to Jerusalem to get a crown. He's going there to die. As Louis Barberi Jr. dryly puts it, one could never say that death took Jesus by surprise. Never took him by surprise. Well, and it shouldn't have taken the disciples by surprise either, should it have? And as we said when we looked at the first passion prediction back in chapter 16, the sense of this word for kill isn't just that Jesus will be put to death. It's not that simple. It's that he'll be killed off. It has a sense of being put out of the way. He's an obstacle in their way, and they want to get rid of him. And what better way for the Jewish authorities to do that than with a cross? With a cross. See, if they'd put Jesus to death the traditional way, right? If the way the Jewish law dictated, if they had by stoning, right, following a fair trial, if they'd done it that way, they knew at the worst he'd get off the hook completely, or at best he'd go down as a martyr in the eyes of the people. And they couldn't afford that. Neither of those options would put Jesus out of the way. He would still be a thorn in their flesh. But a manipulated trial, that would put the advantage firmly in their court. Then, when day broke, what would they do? They would have a trial at night with no crowd around to watch. They would have a trial at night with false witnesses. The advantage is in their court so that when day broke, they could finally hand Jesus over to the Roman authorities under the pretenses of piety to do what they themselves could not technically do. Put him to death. Put him to death. Only Rome didn't stone people. Rome didn't stone those who were determined to be enemies of the state. Their preferred method of death, of course, was crucifixion. But this worked out wonderfully for these religious authorities because they all knew what the Scriptures said about a person who was killed by being hung on a tree. A person left hanging on a tree is cursed by God, Deuteronomy 21:23. Cursed by God. What are the odds? Can you imagine? What glorious luck for them. Not only could they kill this threat to their comfort, this threat to their security, this threat to their authority, they could kill him off. They could really get him out of their way. They could kill him in such a way that would completely discredit him, that made him a stench in the nostrils of the crowd, in a way that made him an obvious imposter, an outcast, even to God, a man who deserved no pity. The elders and the chief priests and the scribes would stop at nothing to protect themselves from Jesus. And most of the world still reacts to him the same way today. So long as Jesus plays ball with people's agenda and with their feelings and with their personal preferences, most of the world, I think, would say they still love Jesus. They love the kindness of Jesus. They love the forgiveness of Jesus. They may even, we've said before, love the sharp wit of Jesus. They love that Jesus says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." They like that. They love that Jesus says, "Let him who has no sin cast the first stone." They're cool with that. That's great. But the moment it's pointed out that Jesus also makes plenty of judgments about the sins they love, and that he calls all sinners to repent from those sins, turning away from them and turning to him as the only way to be saved. Well, the moment that Jesus speaks in the words of a sermon or through the words of one of his people, Jesus once again suffers mockery and must be put out of the way at all costs. And so that's the second thing that will happen to Jesus in Jerusalem. First, he'll be betrayed. Second, he'll be killed. He'll be put out of the way. And now, what's the third thing? We see next in the second part of verse 23 that he will be raised. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. That Jesus will be raised from the dead like one is roused from sleep is just as destined, just as certain as his betrayal and death. It must happen. It will certainly happen. These religious leaders will seek to discredit him by killing him on a cross, but his Father will succeed in vindicating him by raising him back to life from a tomb. And Jesus says this raising from the dead will take place on the third day, which we said before should have called to their minds his words earlier from chapter 16. His words about the sign of Jonah, about the Son of Man being 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish. And what happened to Jonah after being as good as dead? 3 days and 3 nights in the darkness of that fish. He was spit back out again into the land of the living, wasn't he? Except that exactly none of the disciples seemed to hear or understand that part about the resurrection. It just sounds so strange to them. Mark's gospel reminds us that even Peter, James, and John, who were with him up on the Mount of Transfiguration, even to them, they were questioning what this rising from the dead might mean, Mark says. They weren't sure. So that after hearing his words of what would happen to him in Jerusalem, we see at the end of verse 23, instead of being encouraged, they were greatly distressed. You know, there was hope in these predictions of Jesus. There was resurrection hope inserted into these preemptive precautions against transplant shock. They were in there. The resurrection of Jesus meant that because he was raised from the dead, we could be raised from the dead too. Both inside and out, both spiritually and physically, both now and in the future. And even though for now, that hope went unnoticed by the disciples, it wouldn't always be. At that time, writes Leon Morris, the disciples were more impressed by the words about death than by those about resurrection. So Jesus' words grieved them. But, he writes, for Christians through the centuries, and even for these very disciples sometime later, his resurrection has been the heart of faith. And it was Jesus' heart too, for all that it would accomplish in behalf of his people. For the joy that was set before him, we're told in Hebrews 12, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. He knew this death must happen, that it was destined to happen, that it was a divine decree. But one of the reasons he could endure that pain and endure that shame was because he knew that on the far side of it, it would bring new life. There would be new life on the far side of that cross. It's why, even as hard as these words about the cross were, and even as painful as the reaction of most of the Jews was against him, Jesus didn't grow cynical or mean in all the years he walked the dust of our world. Yeah, he looked out over the crowd and was filled with sorrow, even frustration at times. But instead of treating us the way we treated him when he was hated and hurt and hung on a tree, love held him there, and not just those nails. When he was hated and hurt and hung on that tree, forgiveness poured out from him there, and not just his blood. Today we're looking at 3 basic questions about Jesus we need to settle, and that's because many of us, like the 12, still struggle with wrong understandings and expectations about the basics of who Jesus is and why he came, what he came to do, and what it will mean to follow him. And so the first question we have to settle is, who is he? Next, what happens to him in Jerusalem? And now the third basic question we have to settle is, how are we to respond to all this? The simple answer, and it's the true answer, is that we're to respond to the person and work of Jesus with faith. Right? For by grace you have been saved through faith, we're told by Paul in Ephesians 2:8. Faith is the correct response. But what is faith? Or more specifically, what is the kind or what is the quality of faith that saves us? The kind of faith that will carry us safely through the gauntlet of life and the judgment of God. What does that kind or quality of faith look like that will carry us through Judea and on to Jerusalem and even to the far side of a cross? What does it look like? Well, we started out today by talking about how faith is a relationship with God built on trust. We also pointed out that a poor quality faith is a relationship that's lacking some crucial element of trust. We said it's that kind of faith is like paper mache without flour or water. You know, you take out one of these ingredients and everything falls apart. And so, what are the crucial elements or ingredients or aspects that all must be present in order to have a faith that saves us? At the time of the Reformation, there were three crucial aspects of saving faith that were identified from Scripture as needing to be present in a person. These aspects were summed up by three Latin words. Don't worry, we're going to explain them all. There needs to be noticia, there needs to be a sensus, and there needs to be fiducia. The first of these aspects of saving faith is the noticia. The noticia simply means the notes or the data, the nuts and bolts facts that make up the basics of the gospel message that every person must hear and understand if they're to be saved. That make sense? The notes, the data, the nuts and bolts. And these facts must begin with the bad news. You know, it might sound strange to you that the gospel, which means good news, must first be explained by laying out the context of the bad news. But that's the case. That's the case. And the context of the bad news is the problem of sin and the holiness of God. The Bible tells us that God is a holy and just God who cannot tolerate evil or the evil of sin, which is rebellion against Him. He can't tolerate it. And so, as a result, the wages of sin is death. The Bible also tells us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Raise your hand if you're part of the all. Yeah, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, which means that the bad news is that all of us deserve physical and spiritual death penalty in the eyes of God because of the sin in our lives. That's the bad news. But the rest of the gospel data, the rest of the gospel notes, the rest of the gospel nuts and bolts is truly good news. It is good news. And we've already covered most of it in our message this morning. It has to do with who Jesus is and the things that happened to Jesus in Jerusalem to deal with that problem of sin. So that in addition to His perfect life of obedience lived in our place, the bare bones basics of the gospel is that Jesus, who was both God and man, came and suffered and died for sinners on a cross in order to take for us our physical and spiritual death penalty. And then on the third day, after His death, He was raised to new life as a sign that God accepted His sacrifice as a payment for sin. Since the penalty for sin in the Bible is death, the proof God gives that Jesus did all that was necessary to forgive even you is that a dead body came back to life. The body of Jesus. And this was a sign, but it was also a promise. It was a promise that all who put their trust in His person and in His work will also be given His resurrection. That just like Jesus, the one who trusts in Him will one day be raised back to life too. Those are the facts. That's the data. That's the noticia. But if we're honest, we probably all could think of people who know the facts of the gospel very well, and they still aren't Christians, right? Anybody know somebody like that? We all know people like that. For instance, there's many atheists who can present the gospel message as good as you and far, far better than me, but who obviously don't have saving faith. And so the first aspect of saving faith we need is the noticia, but there needs also to be something else added to that. There also needs to be a sensus added to that. The second aspect of saving faith we need is a sensus. And that is a word that simply refers to assent. What's assent? You give your assent to something. What does that mean? You agree. You affirm the content of something. And in this case, it means that you affirm the content of the gospel data, the gospel nuts and bolts that you have heard. You affirm it as true. And so assent doesn't just refer to understanding the basic content of the gospel. It refers to also agreeing with that content, affirming that it is true. And here at this point, you might be tempted to think, well, that's all you need. At this point, you might be tempted to think that these first two ingredients, if you've got them in place, then you've finally got the makings of saving faith, but you'd be wrong. I don't generally enjoy telling people they're wrong, but you're wrong. Not because I say so, but because the Bible plainly tells us in James 2:19 that having the facts about God and agreeing that they're true doesn't qualify you to be a Christian. It just qualifies you to be a demon. I know that sounds harsh, but that's what it says. Even the devil and his demons get that far. James says this, you believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. You hear that? They have a kind of faith too. They know the facts, and they agree that those facts are true. As a pastor friend of mine once put it, Satan is a far better theologian than most Christians. That's a terrifying thought. He knows the facts about God. He agrees that they're all true, but it doesn't mean he has saving faith. And so what is that missing aspect that we still need? What's the missing ingredient of true saving faith? The third necessary aspect the Reformers listed was the need for what they called fiducia. We can hear in that word fiducia a connection to the English word fiduciary. In financial or legal terms, according to Investopedia, a fiduciary is a person or organization that acts on behalf of another person or persons, putting their client's interests ahead of their own. And so in the case of saving faith, Jesus is the fiduciary, and fiducia refers to the act of you personally entrusting yourself to him to act on your behalf, to put your needs ahead of his own. It is looking at Jesus and his work, all the data of the gospel, all the nuts and bolts of the gospel, and believing it's all true. And then it's trusting. It's trusting that it's not just true in general, that it's not just true for some people, that it's not just true for those people, but that it's true for you too. You're putting your life into his hands, and you're believing that what he's done is also true for you. Let's make sure that the difference between these first two aspects of faith and this third are crystal clear in your mind. Say you're visiting Niagara Falls and you see a man walking a tightrope back and forth across the falls, and you're just amazed. You're like, wow, I don't wish I could do that, but that's amazing that he can do that. You're watching him and he's going back and forth, and it just looks like no problem to him. And you're amazed at his skill. Now imagine he faces the crowd. He's come back successfully. He faces the crowd, and he claims he could do the same thing with someone on his shoulders. He says, I can do it. Do you believe him? Do you believe it? Maybe you do. Maybe you're easy to convince, and you're like, oh, yeah, I believe it, man. That's enough for me. He said it. I believe it. But maybe you're one of those stubborn people in the crowd who needs a little more, and so you shout out, seeing is believing. Well, everybody laughs, and so the man surprises everybody by asking for volunteers. And you can't believe it. Somebody actually raises their hand and says they'll go for it. And so he gets this person on their back, and sure enough, with this person on his shoulders, he goes back and forth across Niagara Falls. And you're just blown away. The crowd roars. You roar. You're like, this guy's nuts. Now you believe the man. Now you believe him. You agree with the facts. But are you a believer in a way that includes all three aspects required for the kind of faith we're talking about? The answer is no. You still don't have the faith necessary. Why not? Because there's still one step left to take, and that's to raise your own hand the next time the man calls for volunteers. It's to entrust yourself entirely to his care. That is the last ingredient of true faith. Today we're looking at three basic questions about Jesus that we need to settle. The first question we have to settle is, who is he? The second question we have to settle is, what happens to him in Jerusalem? And now this third basic question we have to settle is, how are we to respond? And the answer to that final question is that we are to respond with this fully formed kind of true faith. The kind that is personal, the kind that has skin in the game, the kind that raises its hand when he calls for volunteers. We said last week that God has called you to live lives of faith in a faithless and twisted generation, just like these disciples. And that's hard enough of a thing to do in the sleepy backwaters of Galilee. But it's going to be a whole other thing for them to do in the coming crucible of Judea and Jerusalem. And so how will they make it? How will they make it? They must understand who Jesus is and what he's there to do, and then entrust themselves to him. And I tell you, the whole thing would be hopeless if Jesus had left it all up to them. The whole thing would be hopeless. But by the goodness and by the grace of God, he's already working here in this text to ensure that that happens for them. What about you? How will you make it? How are you going to make it? What will keep you from caving in to unbelief in this faithless and twisted generation? Will the memories of all the good sermons and Bible stories you've heard do it? Will the memories of all the amazing things you've seen in church do it? Will your track record of church attendance do it? Will all the money and time volunteering, we love the volunteers, will all of that do it? Will the traditions that you keep do it? Will knowing all the Bible facts do it? Will agreement with the truth of those facts do it? Will any of these things ultimately be able to keep you living a life of faith in the Judeas and Jerusalems of the future? No. No. None of them will. Only one thing will do it. He that has ears to hear, let it sink down into your ears. You too must understand who Jesus is and what he came to do, and then entrust yourself to him. You must have that last step. You must entrust yourself to him. You too must believe that what he did by living a perfect life and by dying a bloody death and by being raised from death to life, he did for you. You too must entrust yourself, your hopes and your dreams, your safety and your security, your past, present, and future. You must entrust it all to Jesus. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved. And I tell you, the whole thing would be hopeless if Jesus was leaving it all up to you. But by the goodness and grace of God, he's still working through this little text to ensure that it will happen. Let's pray.